Welcome everyone to Soul Live, and a special welcome to everyone here joining us in our studio and to you at home. I'm Trisha, this is Tom Kelly, and tonight our guest is John Welshons. John is a spiritual teacher, he's a grief counselor, he's a wonderful person, Vipassana meditation leader, and we met him not too long ago, and now he's a brother. And then we know you're going to love him as much as we do and our spiritual community. So welcome, John.
Thank you, Trisha. It's wonderful to be here.
Okay, we're going to, because you're a grief counselor, and we as the collective, I've never had anyone to ask this to, okay? We just lost someone we love very dearly, all of us, Whitney Houston, right? Talk to us a little bit about what happens in the collective psyche with someone that we love but don't know transitions.
That's a really interesting question. You know, and I will share with you that one of the most profound experiences of grief I ever had was when John Lennon was assassinated.
Me too.
I was just flattened by that. And it was because I started to realize a few things. In his case, he was like a brother to all of us. He was like an older brother. And he was someone who, this is a digression, but it's interesting. My first individuation consciously from my parents was because of the Beatles.
Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Those who are over are clapping.
Yeah, we were watching on the Ed Sullivan Show in February of 1964,
Right.
and my parents were sitting there looking at the Beatles going, ugh. And I was right with them at first, you know. Well, my parents say this isn't good, it's not good. But after a little while, I started to realize the Beatles were having a lot more fun than my parents. You know? So there, it was, you know, they were very significant at that moment in my life. Now, I think for Whitney Houston, Michael Jackson, you know, these kinds of celebrities, you know, it's an interesting thing that we're so moved by people who we don't technically know, but we know something about their souls, you know, we feel their soul in their performances and in their music, and those things move us. And I think sometimes people with that kind of talent, you know, are expressing something that we would all like to express, but they're the ones through whom it comes. And we really feel like we've lost a part of ourselves when we lose one of those cultural icons.
Yeah.
Good point.
Why is it, though, that some people can't forget, like Marilyn Monroe or Elvis Presley? It's, you know, that just...
Why, you know, it's an interesting thing. I'm fascinated by that, too. I'm fascinated by our fascination with celebrity.
Yes.
You know, and I think the downside of it is, and you can see this looking at everybody you just mentioned, with the exception of John, because he had gotten pretty healthy when he died.
Yeah.
But, you know, to look at our fascination with people who are famous and talented, but not necessarily happy, you know, that we're really, in some sense, we're training our children in this culture to revere people who may be among the most unhappy people in the culture, and to aspire to be that. You know, and they used to call it the Elvis syndrome, which was the notion because he kind of was the first person in the second half of the 20th century who achieved everything that the culture says we need to be happy, and yet wound up destroying himself because he was so profoundly unhappy.
Right.
Same thing with Michael Jackson, same thing with Whitney Houston, you know, the list goes on and on and on.
Right.
So, and I think that but they become like part of our family, though, and it's it's really disturbing when we see someone end that way when they were so gifted.
Yeah, yeah.
And John, Trisha mentioned that you feel like our brother, and I second that.
Hooray,
And
it's mutual.
I think part of it is just this oozing out of this energy or vibration that I feel coming from your heart. And so where I'm leading with this is that since you have sat with so many people in dialogue, in session, about grief, and you've sat there in their energy of their sorrow and maybe not clear understanding, and that, you know, this was just like a bomb going off in their life, this tragedy, and yet you absorbed it and you gave back to them. So my question to you is, what has been your greatest learning from all that? For you, to sit with so many souls?
The greatest learning, if I were to distill it down to one teaching, is that it gives me a constant reminder that we have no guarantees in life. And a constant reminder that, like, for nearly 20 years now, every morning when I wake up, because of doing this work, as part of my morning meditation, I say to myself, this could be my last day on earth or the last for someone I love.
Really?
How am I going to spend it? Where do I want my mind to be? Do I want my heart to be open or closed? Do I want to be kind or cranky? You know, do I want to be loving or angry? And it really gives you an incredibly focused perspective on what's important in life.
Sure.
And that was really what drew me to the work back in the 70s. First, my friend Ram Dass encouraging me, he was saying back around 1973 or 4 that he felt being with people who are dying was the highest spiritual path he had ever come across.
Yeah, I understand that.
Yeah.
You know, and if I were to be given a choice between officiating a wedding or officiating a funeral, I'll take a funeral any day.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, which he does often, weddings and yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't that
because
interesting?
people are so raw, they're so real,
Exactly.
and the presence is so strong there.
Yeah. All of the BS falls away.
Yeah.
You know, and we just look at life directly. It's hard, it's painful. Just the other day in San Diego, I was with a group of parents who have lost children. Some of them suddenly and unexpectedly, and you know, that is such an extraordinary moment, and yet while they were so emotionally raw, their hearts were just yearning to open and to connect with one another.
So I've met so many people who have been grieving, you know, and so I want everyone to see John's first book, Awakening from Grief, and you studied with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who is legendary in the death and dying process. Tell us a little bit about what it was like to study with her, and maybe what she taught you.
Well, Elizabeth was, you know, when I first met her, I really hadn't quite gotten my mind around this idea of sitting with people who were dying. And I wasn't really interested. I actually was more interested in theories about afterlife. You know, reincarnation and karma and where do we go in the bardos in Tibetan Buddhism and so on. And yet I heard her speak initially at this conference up in Berkeley, and I was just transfixed by the quality of her heart. She spoke simply and directly. She had a pretty thick German accent. She was actually from Switzerland. And she was a tiny little woman. And I think she had to stand on a box behind the lectern, you know. And later, I happened to find myself in the elevator with her at the hotel where the conference was held. And just Elizabeth and me, and I said, oh my God, I'm alone in the elevator with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. So I looked at her and I said, Dr. Ross, what made you the way you are? And she looked me up and down, sort of like I was an idiot. And she said, didn't you just hear my lecture, darling? I said, yes. And she said, well, it's sitting at the bedsides of my dying patients. And then she looked me up and down again. She said, maybe you should try it. And the thing that, you know, training with her was amazing. She was like Mother Teresa much of the time. She had a very cantankerous side, too, which Mother Teresa had. But I think that the thing that really touched me was that when I started working with people, I found so many people who would say to me, and this is not a majority of people, but to this day I would say maybe 40% of the people that I've worked with who are dealing with a terminal diagnosis at some point have said to me something like, I've never felt as alive as I do since I found out I have cancer. Yeah. And, you know, even after training with Elizabeth, that was so bizarre to me when I first heard it. And I thought, well, you know, the disease has gone to their brain, you know, they're not thinking clearly. Fortunately, Elizabeth had taught us to be a little more tactful, to ask questions, you know. And that was a very profound teaching. She said, don't ever think of yourself as an expert in this field. There are no experts. Learn from everyone that you work with, because everyone is going to have something different to teach you. So ask questions. So I would say, well, I can't really understand that. How does that work? How is it that facing your own death makes you feel so alive? And people would say something like, when you know you only have a finite amount of time to live, suddenly everything looks different, and your priorities change, and your senses awaken, and you see sights you've never seen before, and you hear sounds you've never heard before, and you smell smells you've never smelled before, taste tastes you've never tasted before. Everything begins to sound like a great symphony and look like beautiful art, because you're really appreciating the moment. And then I started to see this parallel, because I was already working with Buddhist meditation, which was about living in the moment. And I was seeing how this recognition of mortality was forcing people to live in the moment, and how profoundly that affected them. And then to realize that maybe we could do that too, because there's a certain way in which our culture has always trained us not to think about that. Yes. Don't think about your mortality. Right. Don't recognize that life is uncertain, because it'll make you depressed. Well, you know, I'd say, well, if that strategy worked, great, but what's the #1 most prescribed drug in America? Prozac and other antidepressants. So our strategy hasn't worked, you know. And then I look at cultures where death is out in the open, like India. People seem much happier. It's fascinating. It's fascinating, because it's almost like in this culture, we have this sense that we have time. We were talking about this the other day, like, I'll get around to being loving later, you know, I'll find happiness later. I'll be joyful later. I'll be generous later. I'll be kind later. Right now I'm cranky, but I've got to make money, and, you know. And then, you know, if we are aware of the true uncertainty of life and our own mortality and the mortality of everyone we love, we don't have time for all that. You know, today, now is all we have. And it's amazing, you know, when like my friends Stephen and Andrea Levine really taught me so much about relationship because of their work with terminal patients. And one of the things that they agreed in their marriage was that they would never leave the house angry, because they didn't want that to be the last moment of interaction. So their rule was, no matter what was going on, even if they had an appointment, whatever, they weren't going to leave the house or part in anger. And the other side of the beautiful side of it is when you, and I've done this for years, literally look at the person that you love, who you're saying goodbye to, and you think it's just for the afternoon or something. But the truth is you might never see them again. Well, that could paralyze you with fear and depression, or it could wake you up and say, wow, we better have a really good hug and a really good kiss, and we better not leave anything unsaid. I think those are really the most profound teachings from that work.
Yeah. Nice. What about people, you know, there are terminal illnesses, and unfortunately suicide is prevalent, and we know so many people whose hearts are broken because their loved ones have committed suicide. What would you say to soften that blow? Especially the guilt. The people left behind usually feel so guilty.
Well, you know, a couple of things. First of all, I think that some religious traditions have done tremendous disservice by referring to suicide as a sin. I mean, if we don't have the right to have control over our own bodies, you know, and the other thing is to say, if you were to contend that someone who committed suicide was condemned to hell, that suggests that God would torture people who were already tortured, you know, and that is no God that I know.
Right.
So I think that when we're dealing with a loved one who has committed suicide, we really have to look at it as something that was their right to do, and something that in all probability there was nothing we could do to stop it. Because the truth of the matter is that people who talk about it a lot usually want to be talked out of it. And a lot of people who do it don't talk about it. They just do it.
Is that right?
And so I think you have to really honor the fact that, you know, it's kind of like in dealing with people who are dying and people who are grieving. And, you know, in some sense, I feel like we're all grieving. We're all grieving for something. I mean, and for lots of things. So it isn't just something that we experience in the wake of the death of someone we love, although it gets really strong then, you know. But most of us have a kind of underlying grief. You know, people say to me, are you happy? I say, yes, I'm incredibly happy. People say to me, are you sad? I say, yes, I'm incredibly sad. And we don't understand in this culture that those two things can exist simultaneously. You know, that's part of being a full human being. Now, someone who commits suicide generally doesn't see that possibility. In other words, their sadness is so great, their pain is so great, that the only way they see to be free is to take their own life. I don't encourage it, you know, I don't, I think if anyone comes to me and says, I'm thinking about it, I'd like to talk about it, I always say, well, good, you know, because I think I shared the other day that I had that motivation when I was a teenager. I was a very depressed teenager, and I often came close to committing suicide. And finally, somebody, I think Maharaji, whispered in my ear, you know, you can only do that once. And I thought, hadn't really thought of it that way.
No do-overs, huh?
And then the next statement was, hang in there, it might get better. And I'm so glad that I did, because it's so much better. But, you know, I think that it's especially hard for someone whose child has committed suicide. For a parent, it is just, in any case, when a child dies, part of being a parent is the sense that I should have protected them. I should have done something to prevent this. That's my job as a parent. But it isn't, because, you know, that's playing God, and we while we are God in our souls, we cannot take away anyone else's suffering. That's really not possible. And you can look at it from the karmic perspective. You know, people come to me for counseling, and I know some of them are going to benefit from it and some aren't. You know, sometimes people have what I call the yeah but syndrome. You know? And I say, you could try this. And they say, yeah, but I can't because, and I say, well, you could try this. And they say, yeah, but I can't because. And then I'll say, well, then you haven't suffered enough. Go back and suffer some more. And I don't mean that to be unkind, you know. I think that that's, because we all have to get to a point where our suffering is so great we're ready to change. For some people, unfortunately, the change they decide on is to take their own life.
Yeah.
But it certainly is coming out of suffering, which we all have. But, you know, to think that we failed in some way because we didn't alleviate another person's suffering, you know, there's only so much you can do.
Yeah, yeah.
And sometimes it goes down the way it goes down, and then it's always easy to, you know, in football they call it being Monday morning quarterback. It's always easy to look back and see what you wish you had done differently. But in the moment, the truth of the matter is, you really couldn't have done anything differently.
Well, let's stay
Does
on
that deal with that subject?
It does very well, and it will. Here's another book. Now there's a couple of John's books, and people always ask us, can you recommend? So that's why I'm holding up John's books. You'll see these in there because both Tom and I, look at this. We use them all the time, and I want, when prayers aren't answered, I actually did a class on this.
Really?
Not a workshop, but a Metaphysics and Masters class. And one of my favorite parts in here is a letter that Ram Dass wrote to the family whose daughter was murdered.
Right.
Do you want to, and I have it marked, but it had some profound wisdom.
Oh, that is a gem. That
yeah.
is. Did you want me to read it?
Well, you can, or you can speak to it. It's really up to you. But if you remember the...
Oh, I remember it well. Yeah. In fact, I remember when Ram Dass got this was in 1978, I think, and or 79, and it was a couple who were students of Ram Dass's, and they had moved to Ashland, Oregon. I can't remember where they came from, but they went there because they thought that would be the ideal environment for their children to grow up in. And their 12-year-old daughter one day went out to play with a friend and was abducted and brutally beaten and raped and murdered. And they wrote to Ram Dass and said, you know, we're all about the spiritual path, but we don't know what to do with this. We're devastated. We don't know how to put one foot in front of the other. We don't know how to go on in this circumstance. How do we do it? And Ram Dass got the letter and just started sobbing when he read it. And, you know, in that moment, he didn't know what to say. What do you say? But he knew that the only thing he could do, he had to respond, and he sat down and he meditated for quite a while, and then he sat down and he wrote this letter. Steve and Anita. Rachel finished her brief work on earth and left the stage in a manner that leaves those of us left behind with a cry of agony in our hearts, as the fragile thread of our faith is dealt with so violently. Is anyone strong enough to stay conscious through such teachings as you are receiving? Probably very few. And even they would only have a whisper of equanimity and spacious peace amidst the screaming trumpets of their rage, grief, horror, and desolation. I cannot assuage your pain with any words, nor should I, for your pain is Rachel's legacy to you. Not that she or I would inflict such pain by choice, but there it is. And it must burn its purifying way to completion. You may emerge from this ordeal more dead than alive. And then you can understand why the greatest saints, for whom every human being is their child, shoulder the unbearable pain and are called the living dead. For something within you dies when you bear the unbearable. And it is only in that dark night of the soul that you are prepared to see as God sees and to love as God loves. Now is the time to let your grief find expression. No false strength. Now is the time to sit quietly and speak to Rachel and thank her for being with you these few years and encourage her to go on with her work, knowing that you will grow in compassion and wisdom from this experience. In my heart, I know that you and she will meet again and again and recognize the many ways in which you have known each other. And when you meet, you will, in a flash, know what now it is not given to you to know, why this had to be the way it is. Your rational minds can never understand what has happened, but your hearts, if you can keep them open to God, will find their own intuitive way. Rachel came through you to do her brief work on earth, which included her manner of death. Now her soul is free, and the love that you can share with her is invulnerable to the winds of changing time and space. In that deep love, include me too. So much love, Ram Dass.
There's a discourse there in fierce truth.
Yeah. And those parents are in the movie Fierce Grace.
Are they?
Yeah, and which is about documentary about Ram Dass. And Anita reads the letter, and it's so profound because she's got the original letter in Ram Dass's handwriting. And you can see all the spots on it where tears have fallen on and caused the ink to run a little bit. And she's reading the letter and tears are welling up, but she said, you know, that was our lifeline. That was the thing, when we read that letter, we said, maybe we can get through this. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I feel like a shameless promoter of your books, but I really want... Now, this is your latest book, One Soul, One Love, One Heart. And when I'm asked, now that John has so beautifully written this book, and people say, well, I want to know more about, they'll come into a class and they might hear, you know, Tom or I speak, or any of our teachers, and they're inspired and that sort of thing, and say, well, can I know more? What can I know more? This is perfect. You have the Buddha's principles and the yogic principles. What was your intention? And it has a lot of your life story, which is so wonderful.
Well, the intention was, the book was originally called The Yoga of Love and Relationship. And I was just telling someone outside that the publisher didn't like that because they had a publishing idea that in that period of time, they didn't want any books that had yoga in the title because the market had been saturated or something. So I had to come up with another title, and I was sitting in a restaurant, and Bob Marley's song, One Love, One Heart, came on, and I heard it, and I thought, oh, one love, one heart, one soul, one love, one heart. And I called them up and said, how do you like that? They liked that. So, and the subtitle is The Sacred Path to Healing All Relationships. Now, I realized when I made that statement that it was an audacious suggestion that you could heal all relationships. I think the point of it is that the healing has to happen inside us. That it's possible sometimes in dealing with another human being that you can increase the effectiveness of communication, you can open your hearts to one another, you can develop empathy for one another. You know, amazing things can happen in a relationship, but you have to have two willing partners. If you don't have two willing partners, then the healing has to take place inside ourselves. And it's like the question that always comes up in workshops about relationship, because I'm talking about seeing God in everyone, and most of us have people in our lives, and if not directly in our lives, then people who are on the world stage somewhere, politicians or, you know, whoever, who just get to us, you know. And then the question is, well, how do I see God in that person? And the truth of the matter is, the only way we can do it is to see God in ourselves. And if we find God in ourselves, we open our eyes and holy mackerel, there's God everywhere. So that's really the notion that all relationships can be healed starts there, really. And even if you have a willing partner, that's a good place to go. And I also, you know, I was very interested to see the growth and profusion of yoga schools all over the country. But I got a little concerned about the fact that the really deep teachings of yoga were often being overlooked. And I know that that is not the case here, and that's why I love this place so much. And I love your teaching so much, because, you know, the truth of the matter is that in Patanjali's system of Ashtanga yoga, eight-limbed yoga, asana practice is a fairly insignificant isn't the right word, but it isn't a major part of, you know, it's sort of like brushing your teeth. It's like getting your body ready for meditation. Like you brush your teeth and you eat the right foods and you do the yamas and niyamas and then you do asanas, and then you're ready for meditation and for exploring the deeper truths, which are really about an entire lifestyle. You know, yoga is an entire lifestyle, and I've seen that it's possible for it to become kind of like a competitive form of gymnastics almost.
Sure.
And that, I mean, to me, yoga means union, you know. The purpose of doing yoga and practicing and embracing the yogic lifestyle is to find a way to achieve union with our own Atman, the God within us. And yet I started to see in the modern day yoga movement in America a lot of pride, competitiveness, and you know, not a charitable spirit being generated, but like the classic story, which really was the thing that said, I've got to write a book about this. I was taking a class with a wonderful Hatha yoga teacher, but it was a school that wasn't really invested in the deeper teachings of yoga. And at lunchtime, I went out to lunch and I came back and I watched two people who were in the class having a vicious argument in the parking lot about a parking space. I thought, is this yoga? What kind of yoga is it? And, you know, so I saw the danger in that of really overlooking the true teachings of yoga and just being about developing a certain kind of body. And it really takes good teachers like Tom and Trisha to guide people in the right direction so that the asanas are enhancing the spiritual life rather than enhancing the life of the ego, basically, because they can do either. So, which is why I wanted to call the book The Yoga of Love and Relationship, because I really hoped to introduce that concept that yoga isn't just about physical practices, but it's a whole lifestyle, and it's about cultivating love and compassion and kindness and generosity and connection with God in every moment, and then coming back full circle to seeing God in everyone we see. And I mean, it's such a profoundly fulfilling life. And I just didn't want those teachings to get lost. So I really started with the exploration of the Bhagavad Gita and the three primary yogas in the Bhagavad Gita, Bhakti and Karma Yoga and Jnana Yoga. And then my Buddhist meditation practice started to emerge in seeing how you could apply the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism and the Eightfold Path of Buddhism in relationships, which is wonderful. And so it was really that. It was because it seems to me that for most of us, I mean, it's very easy to be holy when you're alone in the monastery or on a mountaintop. All you have to do is meditate. But the book starts out with a story that I first heard in India, which was about a yogi who had practiced for 35 years up in the Himalayas. And he just was up there and he was in a very high state, and people would come and have his darshan and they would feel great when they left. But he never really interacted with anybody for 35 years, and one day he went down into the local town and someone inadvertently bumped into him on the street, and the yogi wheeled around and started screaming obscenities at this person after 35 years of practice. And you know, the story really says that there's more to this path than just cultivating bliss or cultivating, you know, it isn't just 90 minutes of stretching and releasing tension in order to get up and go back out in the world and get crazy again, you know, that we can take it so much deeper than that and apply it in life. And then ultimately, you know, you could say that the yoga of love and relationship is the most difficult yoga there is. Right. Because if you want to really be stretched, and if you want to really see the places in you where you're stuck and where you're contracted and where you're stiff and rigid, well, just start hanging out with other human beings. And they all come to the surface, right?
And I think that's the value of a spiritual community. Is, you know, it's example that Yogananda gives is like we're all rough cut stones, and when you're thrown into a community setting or life setting, a family setting, and the rubbing up against each other of our sharp edges, that if you see it as a way that the divine is using to smooth those edges rather than to sharpen those edges, that we, through our interactions, can learn so much in how to get along. And then we all get polished that way in this tumbler of life, in this tumbler of relationships. And so we're all these polished stones. And so often in the community that I was in Yogananda's ashram, you know, it's so easy that I could look at almost, I don't know, a big percentage of the monks there and say, why did they decide to come in here? They were exactly the type of people that I wouldn't have chosen to be within 50 miles of in life. And here they all were. Every type of personality that seemed to be the personality that was a sharp edge to my sharp edge. So there was a tendency to want to say to those people, or go to the monks in charge and say, and start talking about, this person has, you know, here we are in the spiritual environment, and you start complaining about all of these people's so-called flaws that you see, right? But here's the quote that St. Bernard said, that if ever there was a monastery, but we could say it may be a household, a home, an office, that didn't have somebody that really just ticked you off to the gills, that it would be worth their weight in gold to go out and find somebody and pay them in gold per ounce or pound of their weight to bring them into that situation. So valuable is that energy that seems to be difficult for us. So valuable is it. So it can smooth out our edges. So,
yeah, it's like, you know, we talk about unconditional love, which is the quality of God's love.
right.
And we're in yoga seeking to find God in our own being. And then we come up against people with whom we are not unconditionally loving.
Yeah.
And how would we get rid of that stuff in ourselves if we didn't interact with those people? And if we didn't start to see them as our greatest teachers, you know, because each time, you know, when I remember first getting this concept when that was the first day I met Ram Dass in 1973. And he made this statement. He said, "Everybody I meet now is my guru in drag." and he said, and if they can suck me in some way, you know, if they can touch my prejudices or my judgment or my desire or my attachment, he said, and then, but all I have to do is just look in their eyes, and I see Maharaji going, "Gotcha."
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's a natural progression, actually, when you think about it, too. With you have amazing characters that you've met in your life that have enriched your expression. I think we see a culmination of everything and everyone who's touched you. You've brought them inside, and your learnings, as the way you express yourself, is just so lovely. And it seems natural to go from teaching people a relationship with their own mortality. That
Exactly.
enables them to look, and well, there's more to me than this body. Then they begin a real relationship with their soul. So it seems that your work is come from an unusual place, but around a beautiful circle.
Yeah, and it actually, you know, when I first studied with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, I realized that what I had learned from her, yes, some really wonderful skills for working with people who were dying and people who were grieving, but also more than anything about relationship, because it was learning to listen, which is, you know, if there's one quality that is absolutely essential in cultivating good relationship, it's listening. Being able to listen to another human being and hear, and not always interpret everything they say through the prism of your own mind, you know, is to be able to hear and receive another human being in your heart. And that's really what she taught me.
Well, that's what you've taught us as well, John. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Such a pleasure to be with you.
Yes.
And John, could you leave us with, well, I'm going to ask you that as you sit in yourself right now, and without even thinking about it, and there was one message you could leave us with, meaning that every soul, every heart on the planet could receive the energy from your heart around this one message, what would be a message you would like to leave us with?
That the recognition that we're all one will bring the greatest joy. And it may also bring great suffering. Because when we recognize that we're all one, we start to realize that we're so interconnected that no one is separate, that everyone on earth who's suffering in this moment is us. And everyone on earth who's joyful in this moment is us. And if we can find our way into feeling that and understanding that, you know, it seems overwhelming. We turn away from it because we say, I can't handle all the suffering in the world. I can't even read the newspaper. I can't watch the news. And sometimes I invite people to do it as a meditation. You know, to sometimes cultivate the ability to look at something that you find abhorrent and see if you can open your heart to it. Because everything, the truth of the matter is, if we're all one, it's all part of us. And when we turn off parts of the world and other human beings, we're turning off a part of ourselves. So, love, 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 love. Love is just more fun.
Well, my friend, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Your presence will stay here, and stay here, and stay here.
Yeah, come back soon, huh?
Yeah.
Well, maybe I won't leave.
Well, perfect.
Namaste.
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 Mm.